You want to share screen, or you want to split? You want to split? Do you want to split screen or not?
Oh, no, we're good. I like everybody to be able to see us.
Okay.
So, everybody, as you can see, Norman is with us. I am super excited to share with everybody this evening the story of how I found Norman online. And now he's here on the Jen Lowry Writes podcast show to talk about Samuel of the Nations, his other work, because it's not just one book for you, Norman. So we're going to talk about your collection of work, how this has all came to be, and just learn from you, the master of storytelling, of how you have taken the lives, the enriching, fulfilling lives of those that have been before us and place them in novel format, engaging, just inspiring, and so authentic. So I can't wait to hear how you're doing it. So, guys, everybody, clap. Norman J. Leaderman-Moore, welcome to the show. Tell us more about you, Norman.
Oh, well, I think my inspiration actually came when I was about 8 years old. My uncle gave me a little book called Storyteller's Scrapbook. And that little book I think it's still in publication today, or you can find it somewhere. Storyteller's Scrapbook. I
I
forget
wrote
the
it
author.
down. I wrote it
And
down to look.
it has all of these wonderful little principles about life and about how to live a decent life and a productive life. Anyway, I've had that all my years. And my professional work is in strategic planning and economics. I was appointed chief planning and development by Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California, and I just had a wonderful career. And I had my own firm after Governor Brown came into California. I knew it was time for me to move on. So I began my own firm and did work in the United States and different parts of the world, and was fascinating. I ended the firm in 2010 and kept working a little while and going to meetings. People would call me to attend a meeting in Chicago or somewhere in New Orleans or whatever. And I said, well, that's going to be about the most expensive meeting you've had in a long time. But anyway, I love genealogy. My name is hyphenated for a reason.
Oh, yes. Tell me about that.
Well, the reason is that
Leaderman-Moore.
I was born in a home for unwed mothers. And the doctor that delivered me was Dr. Eleanor Rogerson, who was the first woman graduate from Stanford University in medicine. And she was given the assignment of working at this particular home for unwed mothers. My mother, who was a teenage girl at the time, 18 years old, was there pregnant with me. And I was to be adopted. Well, my grandmother stepped in and said, no, this baby is coming home with us. And so on the Robertson side, that's my mother's side of the family, I was taken home. And from then, I was raised and eventually discovered, after a long search, a very difficult search, I discovered the Moores, and I discovered my family and my biological family. And so I went to work and started working on genealogy. And my mother had been very adamant about genealogy and its importance. And so I picked up on her concepts of how to research and how to find things.
So was this the day before Ancestry and the Leafs and all of the ways?
Yeah.
Way before.
Yeah, we were pioneering,
Oh, yeah.
Or at least I felt like we were pioneering. And no, it was all handwritten stuff and send letters and travel and, and all that. But everything coming forward now to 2010, I, of course, had a computer. I had links and had all of the internet capabilities. But I was here working on the family history, and I came across this Samuel Saunders who had shown up in my research. And I thought, well, who the heck is this guy? What's he all about? Because I didn't have any his parents. I didn't have his parents. I didn't have anything except some reference to a woman named Pashika. And so it was late at night. I remember it had to be close to midnight when I was doing this. And I thought, I better look into him. And so I started research. And 3 hours later, I thought, holy cow, this guy's really interesting. And I had found him listed in a book that I have on the most famous Jews in America. And I found him related it was said that he was like a son to Daniel Boone. Well, actually, he was a very good friend of Daniel Boone. I found other things about the Native Americans and about the Wyandots and about the Shawnee and the Canada relationships. And so I couldn't sleep the rest of the night hardly. I kept thinking about this guy, and I kept thinking about, I've really got to find out more. So I went to work and I started researching. And that went through a 6-year process of researching. Ended up with over 400 source documents. A pamphlet I found out of the basement of Toronto University in Toronto. A little pamphlet about the building of Boone's Fort. And here was Samuel there with Abraham Lincoln's father. They were friends, and they were involved in that. And anyway, it was just one thing after another of all these documents. And a very dear friend of mine who recently passed away, Jewish friend down in Southern California, Dr. Rabin, Jack Rabin, and I were talking one day, and he got to researching, and he said, well, he was a Jew, and he was a Sephardic Jew. And I said, really? So that went on. And so finally, I looked at it all after 6 years of researching for genealogical purposes. And I said, I've got to write about this guy. And I'd never written a book before.
I've got to stop you because I just am trying to have this. I'm imagining you in a basement finding a pamphlet. Okay, or are you finding one of 400 source documents? Like each find, describe that feeling of a find.
It's indescribable.
I want to hear you try to put it into words because I feel some joy around this, and I need to see how you can describe the find.
I will use one word, and I've given that question a lot of thought. I'll use one word, and it's a word that applies to the entire writing of this book. That word is spiritual. It was a spiritual feeling of connection with people who lived their time, their lives, and had done what they had done, and been what they had been, and have gone on. And that in some small way, I was an inheritor of their footprints.
Mm.
It was spiritual.
I love that.
And when I was writing the book, that gets to a point that I've given a lot of consideration to. And when I was writing the book, I had events. I had actual events, documented events, firsthand accounts, even terminology and recorded blessings and ceremonies and so forth with the Shawnee, Chief Cornstalk and the wedding ceremony, so forth and so on. But when I would attempt to put words, that is, the dialogue, with the events of the actual people, uh, such as Pashika, and such as Samuel, and such as uh, Adam Brown, Chief Adam Brown, Adam Brown Jr.'s father. When I would try to put those words together, sometimes I felt like, no, it's not that, it's this. I feel like I was receiving some kind of guidance, some kind of correction, gentle correction.
Holy
That
Spirit nudgings,
Yeah.
maybe.
So I think the only word I could apply to your question, Jennifer, is yeah, spiritual. It definitely was there, and so I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and my wife at the time, she had Alzheimer's. For about 10 years, I was her caregiver, and she passed away. In 2020 on July 7th. Anyway, she, she would ask me, "How much are you going to write about Samuel?" I don't know. I said, I just feel like I need to keep writing, until I find the end of his life. And of course, I did find that. And I found Nancy, and I found Quindaro, his granddaughter. I found, the other children, and Mary Starr, of course, who I'm related to Samuel through her.
So
And yeah,
I'm pointing everybody, if you're on Spotify listening or listening on the podcast, you can't see the point. So I'm just letting you know I'm pointing because that's how we're related to. So I'm pointing.
anyway,
Yeah, we're related. Found out.
but I wasn't writing to write a book. That was the point of it. I was
Ah,
writing to document this man's life and all of the things that went on in his life. And so anytime I could place him geographically and from a time perspective, and from an event perspective in a historical setting, whether it be in Virginia or whether it be in Canada or whether it be in Ohio or wherever it might be, then I would search that area, and then sure enough, again I would find him. He was a mentor, teacher, and interpreter and translator for Tecumseh. He was behind the scenes in some of the most famous treaties or infamous treaties
yeah.
with Native Americans that has ever been created. Sycamore Shoals, for example, and some of the other treaties which brought all of the nations together and trying to get some understanding as to how the white man and the Native Americans would be able to live in the future. And that's when I discovered that, and I use it quite often from a historical perspective. I ask the question to people: why did the Six Nations, go with the British in the Revolutionary War? And nobody could really answer that question. And I said, well, let me tell you what I think is a plausible answer, because it's historically true. That Chief Cornstalk was murdered. Chief Cornstalk was most beloved, honest, famous, gracious chief of the Iroquois or the Shawnee that ever lived. And he was murdered at Fort Randolph. And when I found that history, and I found that the runners from the nation went out all the way to the Mississippi, to the reaches of up in what we now know as Maine, to Florida, to Mississippi, and on, to tell the other nations Cornstalk was murdered. And he was murdered defenseless. He was murdered coming there honestly, just to simply try to talk the Americans in charge to release his two warriors who had been incarcerated so that they could come home and go hunting and feed their families. And that's the only reason he was there.
Mm.
And he was advised by his sub chiefs and others, no, you need to take weapons. You can't trust these people. He said no, and his wife went with him. A lot of other people went with him, and a few of them were killed as well as the two warriors that he came to Fort Randolph to try to save. Anyway, when I found these things and I saw them, it began to impress upon me the importance of trying to write it into a novel. Again, I've never written a book before. I've done a lot of writing. I've done a lot of technical writing, report writing, and things of that nature, both in this country and Portugal and Spain and England and elsewhere. But I had not written a book, and so
Had you investigated like other historical um, writings too, though, outside of that, how it would be put in narrative form? Did you have anything to go on, or was it that spiritual experience of I'm just going to write this thing and how it comes to me?
no, I said I need to educate myself on what it means to be an author.
That's it.
You know,
And what did that look
because
like for you? Because
well,
that is,
what it looked like is the first thing to do is buy the Chicago rules.
yes, Scott, the big giant
Yeah,
Chicago Manual of Style.
the big one.
It's on the
So
cabinet. It's in the cabinet back there, sitting there,
I
bottom
purchased
shelf.
the Chicago rules, and then I did something else. I thought back on a couple that my grandparents had me stay with for a little short time. They had no children. They treated me like a little prince, and they would read every evening. They were from the old world. My grandparents had helped them get into the United States, and they were from Croatia. Um, and just lovely people. And every evening, they would bring out one of the classics, writing Moby Dick. Oh gosh, I have them all up here. In the library here in the office. All of these wonderful classic, all the Dickens works, Fenimore Cooper. It just went on, and I thought, in order to educate myself a little bit about writing, I better read what writers really write about.
There.
And so I started rereading a lot of these books, and I can remember when I was a teenager, when I was with Alpha and Alan, that's what we would do. We would, in the evenings, we would read. I was a freshman in high school at the time. And that really helped me understand the nature of writing more than anything else. And most importantly, how to communicate a thought, how to communicate an emotion, how to communicate a circumstance, and how to prepare the reader for something that's going to come a little bit later on, and how to make a transition chapter to chapter in sort of that the story is not broken, but the subject magnifies or changes or grows, whatever the case may be. And so that was it. I mean, that's what I did. And then I began to write. And then going back to Dr. Rabin, who was in General Patton's army, by the way. He was a medic in World War II, Battle of the Bulge and all that. And a great reader and an incredibly intelligent man, and had a library to die for. I mean, he had some of the most rare books you would ever want to ever find. But anyway, I would send manuscript to him.
Oh, look at you. You were doing the whole beta reader before you probably knew it was called
Yes,
the
I
beta
did.
reader.
And I said, Jack, I said, do you feel like reading this? Oh, yes, I'll read it. And so he did. And
What a
he
wonderful
would talk,
friend.
he'd be blunt about it. Well, I think you need to do this, or I think you need to. And so that's how that all came together. But 6 years of research, another 2.5 years of writing. And we had Samuel of the Nations looking for a self-publisher, because that's another part of it that I didn't understand the business, the business of publishing. And So after a little frustration with that, I thought, well, I'll just self-publish. And so I found Friesen Press over in Victoria, British Columbia, which isn't too far away from where I live. And although I'm in the United States, I want to make that clear. But anyway, so I went over there and took the ferry and the car, went over there, met with them, and they said, yeah, we'll work with you on this. So there it is.
And
And
it's not.
I have to say that the history that's in there, that's included in there, is factual, as close as I can possibly get it, because I did a lot of traveling. I remember being in conversation with the, well, she was the, wish I could remember her name right offhand, I don't, but she was the executive secretary or leader of the British Maritime Association in London. And talking with her, and I said, you know, I'm coming across this Dr. Denman and this particular ship that my ancestor was on. And she said, oh, I did my master's thesis on that.
And that's a God thing right there. That's how God lines people up in our path.
Exactly.
You have this mission. You've
Exactly. She
inherited
said,
their
oh, I did my
footprints, and the
master's.
Lord's going to help it all, figure it all out.
So she and I had a lot of fun with that, and I said, oh my goodness, here's Samuel being put on board this military ship, sent to the colonies, never to return to England, never, and here he meets Dr. Denman, and Dr. Denman became, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Dr. Denman became the royal family's surgeon aboard the Britannia. It's amazing. And he invented something to help women with small pelvis to be able to survive birthing. It was just incredible, some of the work that he did. And of course, the other, so that helped Samuel, especially when they arrived in Virginia. He was then absolved of his problem with clipping coins, to help feed his family.
Right.
And these other guys,
get passage. Yep.
Yeah. These other guys. Now these guys knew that he was. Well, anyway. So there were things like that happened time and time again that I was just amazed by, and so, yeah, I feel close to him in a lot of ways. The person that helped me with the imagery on the cover, I said, this is how, that uniform on the cover, by the way, is an exact uniform that he wore. That's not a made-up uniform. That is a uniform of a lieutenant in the Indian Department of the British Army, and his horse and him. I tried to capture what I felt he might be,
yes,
in that imagery. And the woman who did the work for me, Robin Beatles, just did, I thought, a marvelous job of putting that image together. But I do have also the book, Quindaro, his granddaughter, one of the most famous Native American women in the world, in the United States anyway, that worked on the Underground Railroad on the Missouri River, the town of Quindaro, the ghost town that I'm sure you must be familiar with, that has recently received national status, by the way. Quindaro is quite a woman. And I'm about 3 or 4 chapters into her book as well, but I'm doing a lot more research because I wanted to find family. I wanted to find people who were related to Quindaro and actual descendants who are in Oklahoma because of the second Trail of Tears out of the Ohio, the Sandusky, and coming into Oklahoma. And Quindaro's husband, who was the first leader, if you will, governor of the Kansas Territory, appointed by the president at that time. her work is just, her humanitarian work is just something to behold. And I think she carries the spirit of Samuel as well. When you read about Samuel, things that he did, the kind of things that he did to help Native Americans from the time he was, quote, baptized into the Native American nation, the Shawnee Nation, adopted, if you will, through that literal ordinance of very sacred ordinance of the Shawnee people. Yeah, he did a lot of things, a lot of interesting things related to not only our nation but others. He worked his little time as a surveyor. He was on some of the great campaigns in the Ohio River and down the Mississippi and up into Canada. Then he spent some time in the Caribbean. Yeah.
So now the granddaughter, and you have other work.
Yes,
And I'm thinking all of this research and how much you pour into this.
well, the same thing happened with Jaded Horses. That's the second novel. Jaded Horses, I discovered in my Moore family in Tennessee, that there's all this things going on with Mexico, and there was Manifest Destiny, a lot of other things going on politically and economically in the country, and the movement westward, and so forth. And so, the Mexican-American War took interest, and I discovered the Moore cousins that got together, and of course they were young kids thinking they were infallible. They could do anything. And it's about their relationship with their horses in getting to the war itself, and then getting home. And there's sort of a love story involved there too that I discovered in terms of the marriage of one of the older cousins. But I just really enjoyed that. And here again, that word spiritual comes in mind because I was struggling to try to find documentation. I wanted absolute documentation everywhere I could find it. And I happened to be rifling through the Smithsonian documents in Washington, D.C., and came across a reference to a certain colonel who happened to be the colonel in charge of the regiment in which these boys were. And this guy, I guess he was homesick, this colonel, because he wrote letters every day to his wife.
Aww.
And somebody, a great nephew or somebody, had retained these letters, and they had been digitized and put into Smithsonian. And so when I was able to draw these letters back into my environment, here I had day by day, hour by hour account of everything that went on, in which Cameron and these other kids were in that war. Voila, here we go, And so again, it became a matter of putting words to events, the dialogue. And I began to think on that again and again and again. And as I was writing, and the same thing would happen. It would happen. No, that's not quite right.
Move every little here.
Yeah, a little.
Here.
This is what happened. Okay, rewrite that. But yeah, Jaded Horses. It's in three basic elements of the book: the war, getting to the war, which was a huge effort; the war itself, and the devastation of war. And in that regard, I found something that I thought was very special. I found a document that refers to a young woman who's Mexican. Her husband had been killed. She was in her 20s. The generals were arguing at a peace table in Monterrey about the surrender of the Mexican army. And they were contesting with one another and, sword rattling and going on and on. and it did not look good. This girl walked into that war room with these generals all arguing with each other and said a certain thing. I don't have the book in front of me, but it's an actual recording of her words. Said certain words that brought peace and understanding to the warring sides to allow the Mexicans and the Mexican army at that time to withdraw with dignity. In other words, to be able to walk away from the battlefield with dignity without anybody else being killed or hurt. And there was a horrible number of bad things that went on, perpetrated by both Mexicans and Yankees or Americans in that war. And I documented that as well and wrote that into the script, wrote that into the dialogue. And Cameron, the main character there, it was obvious what his role was, as a fighter. But he also had been given a charge by his father before he left the plantation in Tennessee, and that is that he's to be honorable in terms of his fighting. When he has an enemy subdued, he's to be kind and to have charity in his heart, is the word that I could use. And he did. And he came home with honor. And so it's quite a story. The Moore family goes right back to the Revolution, of course. A lot of people talk about and of course it's part of history, about the Minutemen and the first shot fired, heard around the world, on and on and on. Well, actually, the first shot fired was at the Moore Creek in North Carolina.
Yes, sure was.
Studied
that one last semester with my son.
You have that one, huh? Okay.
Yes, got that one.
Well, they ambushed a British patrol right there at Moore Creek near the Moore farm, and North Carolina. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but I enjoyed that, and then I went on, and my most recent book, All But One. That book tugs at my heart more than anything else, about the Putnam family, related to the Moores, my ancestral Moores, and the Texas Revolution, the children who were abducted by Comanche, and the father's search for his children for over 20 years. I don't know if you've seen that book or not, but...
No, I have not. Not that one.
Hang on just a minute. I'll just show you the cover.
I am so glad you guys have joined me this evening. I am absolutely loving our conversation and hearing all about how Norman, all but one, how Norman has taken pieces of history, genealogy, golden nugget finds, and allowed them to tell their stories. Really, that's what it all boils down to. You've just given them a place and they're just continuing to tell their stories.
Well, the last paragraph of All But One, the front door opened wide, allowing a gaggle of children and Gonzalez folk to fill the room. In an instant, we were smothered by children and 3 dogs who beelined for the kitchen. Last to enter were Sarah Elizabeth and Judith Lucy, locked arm in arm, talking in whispers, as sisters who love each other normally do, at peace with themselves and the world.
Ah, Norman.
Now, these are the 2 sisters. The one had been gone for over 20 years. They had been little sisters together when they were very young, in their 5, 6-year-old, 7-year-old. And one recognized the other. And that's the name of the chapter. And the last chapter is titled Sister, Oh Sister. When they recognize each other there in Gonzales, Texas. Anyway, this book, Gonzales, about all but one, is, I think it's an account of learning that wonderful principle. How should I put it? That wonderful principle that, well, I was just talking about this just today with somebody else, where somebody said, I have learned that not shrinking is more important than surviving. Not shrinking from duty, not shrinking from responsibility, and not shrinking from what God has placed before us to challenge us is more important than merely surviving. Because it tells the character of who and what we are, really.
Yes.
And this book, all but one, tries to, in my feeble way, capture that principle through the women, the men of Texas who went through horrible, horrible times beyond our imagination during that revolution and after. And then to have their children abducted. The mother, Rebecca, literally died of a broken heart when her children were gone. But anyway, that's all but one. And now I'm into a book. I'm in chapter 11 of 13 chapters in a book called Where Pelicans Fly. And it's a story based.
Is this another one based on ancestry?
Yeah. And there's one other called that I'm working on with more research. We're related to these people. They're called the Chapman family. And it's called The Eighth Heaven. And it's a true account of Thomas Chapman, who came with Sir Thomas Dale, who was commissioned by Prince Henry to save Jamestown, the Jamestown adventure or business venture. And Thomas Chapman came. He was married at St. Mary's Cathedral in London to his wife, but she was underage at the time, and the marriage could not be consummated. And she went back to Christ Hospital Orphanage in England, where she was, along with her sister. And he came with Sir Thomas Dale with the flotilla of 3 ships that came to save Jamestown. She joined him 6 years later, and they had marvelous plantations and agriculture, and of course it's the Eighth Heaven. The Eighth Heaven comes out of a document that I've discovered where he had met in a journal. It's recorded that he had met an old Jewish sailor who had been on another ship, and on that other ship, this Jewish fellow had mentioned that he had learned that there was a sect in ancient Israel of rabbis who made it their dedicated work to try to discover where God lived. And it's interesting that they refer to themselves as the sect of Kolob. And Kolob has some reference biblically in terms of the domain of God, or where God lives. And so Thomas Chapman refers to that as the Eighth Heaven. and that's where he would like to have his family be sometime after this mortal experience. But anyway, I'm working on that one. It's
Wow. Multiple books at once. Aren't you an
yeah.
author now, Norman? Let us say. Aren't you?
I'm just having fun.
Oh,
I
I
have
think
had
so.
lot of fun. And sometimes I have to tell you though, sometimes I will sit and I will just tears will come to my eyes, and I just sit here and just marvel at these people. And it's like going back to Samuel. When I reread Samuel sometimes, or I draw excerpts from the book, I thought, my goodness, you know, Pashika's death was so unnecessary, so unnecessary. Chief Maluntha out there pleading, holding the American flag, pleading for his life in that village in Ohio in Sandusky, the lower Sandusky. Oh, it's humbling, really, to be involved in this kind of writing. I'm not a good. I mean, I can create a story, I suppose, but I'm not uh, um, a fictional kind of Star Wars kind of person. I
But
am
you've
not.
always had the storyteller's scrapbook, and that
There
one
you
was
go.
embedded
There
in
you
your
go.
heart
That's
right
it.
there.
Uh,
Yep, it
you're
all
right.
started right there.
Right, Jenny. I mean, I come back to that again and again and again, where Storyteller's Scrapbook was the beginning when I was 8 years old.
But when you said it's humbling, and you do have those moments when you're brought to tears, I believe that that's why you have been gifted with this ability to tap into these sources to be able to continue these stories, as you say, inherited their footprints. Because it's a person as you that can take on a task like that and try as much as we can to capture the spirit and the heart to flesh and bone and attach it to somebody who once was but still is through the written word, through us, through generations. They still are.
You use the word capture. Excuse me. That's so important. When I wrote All But One, I began to realize that in order to capture the the nature of their conversation with each other, I had to go to the dialect of the English language that they use. And so what I did is I began to research that, and I found there are over 25 dialects of the English language in the United States, the continental United States. And I began to realize that these people were all of the Southern Appalachia dialect. And when I realized that, I began to say, okay, what's the language they use? It's different than what I use. It's far different in a lot of ways. And when I discovered that, because it has meaning, it has context, it has inference, it has application that people instantly take into their hearts as an element of understanding.
And
And
it's
so
personal, and it's personal.
it's personal, very personal, and so that's what I did. I brought the Southern Appalachia dialect of the English language into All But One, and I've been criticized for it. I was amazed when some some critique reader, I don't know, Goodreads or somebody like that said, "Well, it's bothersome to read because of the way the language is," And I thought, wait a minute, that's how people talked, you know. And but anyway,
And you're not going back in and editing it to it to
no,
not even a
no,
T. You
no,
you you
I am
keep
not
it authentic and you keep it in line to honor
exactly.
their way. Because
Exactly. I want it their way because it is their way.
way. It's their way. Exactly.
And I'm just the interpreter, the translator, if you will.
Yes. Love it. Well, I want to tell you, Norman, I have thoroughly enjoyed our time together. I hope this is not a one and done. for us that you will be able to be back on the show in the future to talk more about
you.
writing. And I would love to introduce you to my children so you can um,
Absolutely.
meet my boys. I've just
Absolutely.
absolutely just have loved this time. One last piece of wisdom that you can impart on those out who are seeking to write stories, whether nonfiction, fiction. What's a piece of wisdom you would like to share with our authors out there listening?
I think the one thought that repeatedly comes back to me is that when we write about real people, real events, that we're writing about God's children. And the integrity and the sanctity of that is a responsibility we take upon ourselves if we dare write at all.
Love it.
So I would think that be respectful, be be understanding that these people are just on the other side of the veil. They're our ancestors. There are people of times past, and their lives, as we would wish for our own, should be, must be, will be respected.
Love. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening for the podcast. Truly have loved having you here, Norman. Samuel of the Nations is out where books are sold, along with all but one. And you have your Jaded Horses, and now you have other books out in the works. So we have definitely got to continue to follow Norman on his path of telling stories of the past and making them into our homes today. So thank you so much, Norman. And I hope you have a blessed and wonderful evening. Guys, thank you so much for joining us here at Jen Lowry Writes.